Hey MOC, welcome back to Wednesdays in the Word. I hope you enjoyed the Word last week. I know I got a lot out of it. And so this week we're going to pick back up in our series, Mysterious Ways, how God leads us through the wilderness. And we picked up on 5 major principles that they all began with P. And I hope that you guys downloaded the sheet and filled that out as you went along. This week, like I promised, we're going to pick it up with a particular person in the scriptures who it seems like the wilderness had its work on them. And so this week we're going to talk about a person named Daniel. Now Daniel and his friends were kidnapped from their hometown and they were taken to Babylon, which was a massive empire that was trying to take over Israel. It was a constant enemy and they were constantly having battles, and Babylon ends up winning the battle, destroying the temple, and then exiling Daniel and all of his people. And so because of this process, which was not a quick process, we know that primarily those 5 things were definitely worked in Daniel. And what we see in the book of Daniel is how he proves that those things were worked into him. Now remember, we said that the wilderness is always preceded by a promise. We said that the wilderness was a proving ground. We said that it prepares our spiritual palate. And we also said that it produces gratitude. But ultimately, the wilderness is about God showing us what a good father he is. And so we see that in the story of Daniel. Now this week we're not going to do as many Bible passages. We're going to go by chapters. So I hope that you all will look at some of these chapters on your own and jump into the story. But first of all, let's look at Daniel's excellence. And we see that in chapter 1. When King Nebuchadnezzar kidnaps Daniel and his friends, we see that there are beautiful things that are said about them right off of the bat. So Daniel and his friends are given the opportunity to learn about the culture and the customs of a foreign nation. So they were given 3 years pretty much. And what they had to do is learn and study all of the customs, all of the stories, all of the history, all of the cultural practices of Babylon. And they were basically given an education that was completely different than their own. But instead of running from the situation, Daniel was probably one of the most astute people in Babylon at that time. He studied harder and learned more than anybody around him. And so I think what the wilderness produced in Daniel was definitely excellence. And we see that because we see that Daniel, no matter what setting he found himself in, he's showing us that God calls us to excellence, whether in time management or study, or because we're to be excellent in areas that we're going to be leaders and witnesses in later in life, and to those around us that God has called us to. And so even though Daniel found himself like a fish out of water, he purposed in his heart. In chapter 1, it says that Daniel had purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. And so there's this decision that he has made. And I think that that decision that he made was produced by his time in wilderness. And he purposed in his heart to be successful in Babylon, but not to defile himself. And he showed them that he didn't have to indulge in order to have influence. And I think that's something that we can learn from Daniel, that just because we're in the culture, it doesn't mean that we have to indulge in it just to have influence in it. That's a lesson for us. We don't have to run away from the world to be holy, but we also don't have to become like the world to be helpful. Then we go on and we follow Daniel's life into chapter 3 and in chapter 9. And both of these chapters demonstrate something I think the wilderness produced in Daniel. And that's Daniel's expectations. Remember, we talked about how he had purposed in his heart to remain faithful, and he was in a tough situation because he knew that God would keep his word. He didn't let that cause him to disbelieve. So Daniel knew the word, and he remembers that, so he doesn't bow to the idols, and he also calls out to God based on God's what? Promises. Every wilderness is preceded by a promise. So in Daniel chapter 9, he remembers God's promises, and he begins to go, he goes into a deep moment of prayer on behalf of his people. And he believed what God had said. In Jeremiah chapter 29, God makes a promise to his people, and he says, after 70 years of captivity, I will deliver you. Well, Daniel remembers that, and he takes the time to say, God, it's about that time. It's been 70 years, and I know what you said. And he goes on his face before the Lord and begins to cry out for the deliverance of his people. So do we have expectations like Daniel? Maybe we have friends or loved ones or things that we've been praying for. Are you willing to wait for that thing and to believe for that thing for 70 years? Some of us can't even imagine being 70 years old. But that's the amount of expectation that is demonstrated in Daniel. And it doesn't come out of anywhere. It comes out of him being formed and proved in the wilderness. Then we look at Daniel in chapters 4 and 6, and we see his evangelism methods. And I love that about Daniel. I like that Daniel wanted people to know who his God was, and that by the end of Daniel's life, even his enemies were calling his God the Most High God. So they were given 3 years, like we said, to learn all of these customs, but they didn't let that cause them to indulge rather than influence. And so we see that Daniel, in chapters 4 and 6, he has a brave witness. In the face of adversity, Daniel, he has a unique strategy that he uses. He speaks boldly about God, that God is the Most High King, and that ultimately that's where his allegiance lied, but he was not afraid to partake in the culture. The culture was not going to have power and dominion over him. And that's something that we can learn as we think about holiness and as we think about being different from the world and being in the world and not of the world. I know a lot of us has probably heard that before in our lives, especially if we've grown up in the church. But what I think being in the world and not of the world means is more about proximity, or less about proximity and more about posture. How we treat the world, how we think about the world, how do we believe what the world says will lead to success? Do we believe what the world says will lead to happiness? And Daniel's ultimately saying no, but that doesn't mean that I live off in a corner somewhere and I don't engage my culture. So I love his evangelism strategy. So the fact is that he begins to tell people that his God is the Most High God, but it doesn't turn him into somebody who is unrelatable or can't be dealt with or can't be talked to. And I like that about Daniel. And then in chapters 9 and 12, we look at Daniel, and these are kind of coming towards sort of the end of his life, but these are also chapters that have a lot of cryptic visions in them. And what's cool about that is that it demonstrates to us that somehow the wilderness has affected Daniel's eschatology. I know that's a big word. It just means end times or the things of the end. And so the thing about Daniel that I wanted to highlight lastly is that in Daniel chapter 9 and 12, or 9 through 12 rather, we see that he has been given this eternal perspective, that his time in the wilderness has produced that gratitude that we talked about, and that he's been given this perspective of the end. He knows what's coming, and that's how come he can live day by day in faithfulness. So as we looked at his life, many of us wonder what gave him all this courage. I mean, he was in a lion's den. He was in fiery furnace situations. He was having to stand before Babylon. And this was a serious, serious thing. And so they give us the answer to our question. Daniel knew the end. He knew where things were going. He knew that empires fall, but one kingdom will reign. God had given him that revelation. And that revelation of the end and that knowledge and that hope that we have towards the end is what gives us strength to have courage day by day. And so whether it's Daniel's eschatology or his expectation, his evangelism strategy, or his excellence, we see that the wilderness has produced these things in this young man, Daniel. And we're given a picture of his life over time. From a young man to an old man, the book of Daniel gives us a snapshot of what does a person who engages and goes through and trusts the mysterious ways of God and follows God through the wilderness. What does a life like that lived out look like? And I think we can see it in Daniel. So thank you guys so much for coming to Wednesdays in the Word this week. We'll be back with you. Make sure you check us out on Friday at noon for our live Zoom. We can talk more about these things. I appreciate being with you guys. Thanks for jumping in. Grace and peace. Thank you.